Hi, I'm Liam Karen, and this is Architecture Topics. To all our subscribers, welcome back. And to those of you who are new to the show, Architecture Topics is the podcast where buildings aren't just buildings. They're stories about cities, ambition, design, politics, people. And today, we're heading to London, just before the turn of the millennium. A city proud of its past, but suddenly gripped by a desire to look forward. Today, we are going to be talking about the London Eye, that enormous, slow-spinning wheel on the south bank of the Thames. Maybe you've seen it in person, maybe you've watched it glide behind James Bond, or in a nice, peaceful postcard of a London sunset. But behind its elegant rotation is a much bumpier story, a story of private risk, political delays, temporary intentions, and unexpected permanence. And at the center of it all is a question. How do you build a monument to the future in a city so defined by its past? Let's get into it. The late 1990s in Britain felt oddly optimistic. After years of political fatigue, a fresh-faced Tony Blair was promising a new kind of politics. Cool Britannia was splashed across magazine covers, mixing Britpop swagger with Union Jack nostalgia. The economy was relatively stable, the internet was still a novelty, and for a brief moment, it seemed like anything was possible. Then the year 2000 started approaching, and many didn't see it just as a date. It suddenly became a deadline, a marketing opportunity, a reason for governments and cities across the world to commission something symbolic, something that said, we've arrived in the future. France would welcome the new millennium from the Eiffel Tower. America from the Statue of Liberty. But what about Britain? How would Britain mark the beginning of a new millennium? The official answer, as far as the government was concerned, was the Millennium Dome. Designed by Richard Rogers and built in the Greenwich area. It was backed by public funds and political ambition. And while it would later be renamed the O2 Arena and become one of the most successful entertainment venues in the world, at the time, it just didn't quite capture the public's imagination. But across the river, in a very different kind of office, another idea was quietly taking shape. It didn't come from a government committee or a royal commission. It came from a husband and wife architecture practice, David Marks and Julia Barfield. They weren't famous. They weren't rich. They didn't even have a client. But what they did have was an idea. One evening, flipping through a design competition brief that never actually launched, they started wondering, what if we built a Ferris wheel? But not just any Ferris wheel. What if we built the tallest one in the world? A structure so bold and so public that it would become a symbol not just of the year 2000, but of London itself. The idea was risky, maybe even naive. But hey, if the government wasn't going to build something iconic, maybe someone else should. So they got to work. David and Julia didn't want fairground nostalgia. They wanted something elegant, architectural, and rooted in precision. The inspiration wasn't Coney Island. It was clockwork, a giant, rotating observatory for the city. They called it the Millennium Wheel. It would be 135 meters tall, making it the tallest observation wheel in the world at the time. It would tower over the Thames and offer a full 360-degree view of London, unobstructed, serene, and slow. Each of the 32 capsules would carry up to 25 passengers and remain perfectly upright thanks to motorized stabilization, not dangling freely like on a traditional Ferris wheel. This all sounded great, but here's the thing. Marks and Barfield had no commission, no funding, and no official support. So they became developers. They pitched the idea to investors. Most said no. They went to the British government no again. Until eventually, they found backing from a surprising place. British Airways. The airline was looking for a high-profile project to sponsor for the Millennium and saw the wheel as the statement they were looking to make. That support unlocked momentum. A dream team of engineers came on board, including the legendary Tony G and partners, and Hollandia, the Dutch steel specialists. It was also British Airways who started marketing the project not as the Millennium Wheel, but as the London Eye, and the name stuck. But even with British Airways on board, it was far from a done deal. Because here's the truth. No one had ever done anything like this before. Not just structurally, but politically. This wasn't a government project. There was no official committee and no public funding. It was a private idea, backed by a private sponsor, trying to wedge itself into one of the most heavily regulated urban environments in the world, central London. So how did they pull it off? First, let's talk money. British Airways did eventually cover the majority of the cost, around 75 million British pounds, but it wasn't all up front. And it wasn't without friction. The airline didn't want to own the wheel, they just wanted to sponsor it, which meant Marks and Barfield were still on the hook for delivery, coordination, and risk. Then there was the land. The site they wanted, a prime stretch of riverbank right across from Big Ben, was public land. Technically under the control of the South Bank Centre, with additional oversight from the city, the Port of London Authority, the London Borough of Lambeth, and others. The pitch to overcome all this? It would be temporary. Just 5 years. A celebratory structure for the Millennium to be dismantled by 2005. That promise is what helped push it through the red tape. It made the project easier to swallow politically. Like, fine, let them build their wheel. It'll be gone in a few years anyway. Of course, it didn't go that way. But at the time, the temporary status made it possible to bend the rules. The project still had to fight through planning permissions, environmental reviews, riverfront regulations, and massive public skepticism. Some saw it as a novelty. Others, a vanity project. There were protests, there were lawsuits, everything you could expect. But momentum had taken hold. The media loved it. Tourists were curious, and behind the scenes, British Airways kept things moving. Not just with funding, but with lobbying power and corporate muscle. In short, this wasn't supposed to happen. And it certainly wasn't supposed to last. But somehow, in that tiny window of millennial optimism, they pulled it off. Now back to the design. This was a highly complex structure and radically different from any Ferris wheel that came before it. A traditional Ferris wheel, like the kind you'd find at a fairground or amusement park, is mounted on two sides. Think of a giant rotating circle fixed between two vertical towers, like a bicycle wheel held at both ends of the axle. The forces are balanced, symmetrical, and the whole thing is stabilized by a rigid A-frame structure. But the Millennium Wheel didn't do that. Instead of being held between two towers, it's cantilevered. In other words, it's supported on just one side, leaning out over the river, with nothing bracing it from the other side. And let's not forget about the scale. The design was as tall as an average 45-story building. This created another major challenge. Traditional Ferris wheels use rigid radial arms to connect the perimeter of the structure, the rim, to the rotation center, the axis, or hub. And these elements can carry both compression and tension, depending on where the load is at any moment during rotation. But at the scale of the Millennium Wheel, that wasn't practical. The radial elements were so long that any compression force would have caused them to bend or buckle. To resist that, they'd have to be unreasonably thick. and that would have ruined the design. The structure had to appear light and delicate, almost like it was floating. So the solution was to avoid compression entirely. Instead, the team used a purely tension-based system, mimicking the spoke pattern of a bicycle wheel, but on a monumental scale. By working only with tension, they could reduce the size of the radial structure to the point where beams could be switched to pre-tensioned cables. A light, lacy geometry that looked effortless. Even though it was anything but. The rim of the wheel was held in shape by 80 steel cables radiating from the central hub like a giant spider web. The tension in those cables kept the rim rigid, while the hub, the spindle, and a massive A-frame on the landward side handled the rest of the load. To emphasize the floating effect even further, the capsules weren't suspended like on a typical Ferris wheel. Normally, passenger cars are attached with pivoting arms that let them swing freely as the wheel turns, like gondolas hanging from hooks. This means when your car is at the bottom of the ride, it sits outside of the circle. But when you are at the top, your cart hangs inside of the structure, and all those radial elements get in the way of a clear view. But on the London Eye, each capsule is fixed to the outside of the rim and doesn't swing at all. Instead, they are mounted on a motorized ring that keeps it perfectly level as the wheel rotates. This was an architectural decision, yes, but also a psychological one. You don't feel like you're dangling. You feel like you're gliding, orbiting the city in a smooth, steady arc. But don't forget that up to this point, everything was still just on paper. Now, it was time to actually build it. And here's where it got even trickier, because it couldn't be built upright. So, they built it lying down, on floating barges, on the river. Piece by piece, they assembled the wheel horizontally on the south bank, then slowly, over several days, pulled it upright using an elaborate system of cables, hydraulic rams, and massive counterweights. Londoners watched it rise, literally, from the water. It was unlike anything the city had seen. Futuristic, but also strangely poetic. By the end of 1999, it was standing tall and ready to spin. Except, it didn't. The original plan was to open on New Year's Eve, 1999, perfectly timed to mark the start of the new millennium. But as the date approached, engineers ran into problems with the capsules. The cladding system that sealed the glass pods wasn't behaving as expected under wind loads, and there were concerns about safety and pressure equalization. In other words, the wheel was there, standing tall, beautifully lit, but you couldn't ride it. The symbolic moment passed. Fireworks lit up the sky. The Millennium Dome opened with full fanfare, and across the river, the Eye stood still, not yet turning, but already unmissable. It would be another 3 months before the first paying passengers boarded. And when they did, it was worth the wait. From the moment it opened in March 2000, the London Eye was a hit. Lines stretched along the South Bank. Londoners who had once dismissed it as a gimmick or an eyesore now wanted a turn. Tourists flocked to it. Newspapers that had mocked it now ran glowing reviews. And the view was the star. For the first time, you could see London from above, gently orbiting at walking speed. It took 30 minutes per revolution. You saw the city not in a blur, but in layers. The Thames curling like a spine. The Houses of Parliament, St. Paul's, the Shard to come. A city, old and new, stitched together from above. Even those skeptical about the wheel's aesthetic started to change their minds. And slowly, a new question began to emerge. What if this wasn't temporary? The original agreement, remember, was for 5 years. By 2005, the wheel was supposed to be dismantled, taken down, gone. But just 1 year after opening, It had become one of the most visited paid attractions in the entire United Kingdom. It was drawing in millions of people a year, driving tourism, activating the South Bank. So discussions began about extending its stay, first unofficially, then formally. But making the eye permanent wasn't as simple as letting it stand. The original permissions had been granted under the assumption that this was a short-term structure. So if it was going to remain, it needed new planning approvals, new safety reviews, and a whole new legal framework. And then there was the structure itself. The London Eye was not designed to last forever. It was engineered to function for 5 years, maybe 10, and then be dismantled. That's what justified certain material choices, maintenance assumptions, and even construction tolerances. Turning it into a permanent piece of London's skyline meant rethinking all of that. Maintenance protocols had to change. Structural components had to be reassessed. Agreements with the city and surrounding landowners had to be renegotiated. It took years of legal, financial, and technical work behind the scenes. But in 2006, a full year after the original deadline, the Eye was officially granted permanent status. It had gone from a one-time celebration to a long-term landmark. This placed the London Eye in the same category as the Eiffel Tower, which had also started as a temporary structure and ended up becoming the icon of the French capital. Today, the London Eye feels like it's always been there. It shows up in postcards and movies, in Olympics coverage, and New Year's Eve broadcasts. It's part of London's mental skyline, just like Tower Bridge or the Dome of St. Paul's. What's remarkable is that the Eye doesn't dominate that skyline. It doesn't try to outdo the buildings around it. It frames them. It lets you see them from above. It offers a new way of experiencing the city, not through history or ceremony, but through clarity. The London Eye isn't just a Ferris wheel. It's a turning point in London's skyline and in how we think about the future. Thanks for listening to Architecture Topics. If you enjoyed the episode, consider following the show and leaving a review. This way you won't miss any future episodes. Plus, it helps more people discover these stories. I'm Liam Karen, and I'll be back soon with more stories about iconic buildings, cities, and the people behind them. Until then, keep looking up.